If there's one thing humanity is relearning right now, it's that one enemy is deadlier than all of the rest. You can't fight it with armies, you can't bring it to the negotiation table, you can't destroy it forever. This is what Gondor learned in 1636 of the Third Age. The men of Gondor had survived corruption, they had defeated Sauron once before, they had subjugated the Haradrim and the Easterlings, and they had survived devastating civil wars. But what came next would bring the entire kingdom to its knees in merely a single year. I'm talking about the Great Plague. If you're unfamiliar with the Great Plague of Middle-earth, then that is totally fine. After all, it only occupies a couple of paragraphs across all of Tolkien's works. It was probably the single most devastating event of the Third Age, killing countless amounts of people and depopulating entire regions. In several years, it did more damage to Gondor than any of the invasions of Sauron and his allies across a period of 3,000 years combined. If you're familiar with European history, then it's pretty clear that the Great Plague is fairly comparable to the Black Death, which swept across Europe, Asia, and Africa in the 14th century. So, what actually happened? Well, let's go through it, in detail. Sometime in 1635 of the Third Age, or possibly even before that, a sickness arose in the lands east of Mordor. This sickness began to sweep westward, through the lands of Rhûn, killing indiscriminately and leaving vast amounts of death behind it. This is the beginning of the Great Plague. In the winter of 1635, the Great Plague reached the kingdom of Rhovanion, a strong ally of Gondor in the north. In other circumstances, the men of Rhovanion might have escaped much devastation, as they didn't have large cities where the plague could spread easily. However, the plague arrived during an especially cold winter, and the halls of Rhovanion were filled to bursting with people trying to find shelter from the cold. Unfortunately, it appears that some of these people brought the plague with them, and it ripped through these densely populated halls, killing untold thousands of people. The men of Rhovanion, who weren't overly skilled in the arts of healing or medicine, were helpless in the face of this sickness, and by the end of 1635, over half the population of the kingdom of Rhovanion was dead, as were the majority of their horses. By 1636, presumably by trade or by people fleeing the disease, it was inevitably spread to the kingdom of Gondor in the south. In Gondor, the plague spread even easier, ripping through the densely populated cities, although none of the cities suffered anywhere near as bad as Osgiliath. It was there where King Telumnar, who had ruled Gondor for a mere 2 years, died along with all of his children. Thousands of Osgiliath's inhabitants fled the city during this time, fleeing into Ithilien or Anorion, and this would begin Osgiliath's slow decline into complete ruin. Although not suffering near as badly as Rhovanion, likely due to their advanced skills in healing, Gondor still suffered an unimaginable death toll. Of the 3 major events that weakened Gondor during the middle years of the Third Age, the Great Plague was undoubtedly the worst. The plague then continued northwest, through the lands of Calanador, later known as Rohan. These lands were also devastated by the Great Plague, further weakening Gondor's influence over the northern lands. From there, the plague passed into Eredor and swept northwards towards the lands of Arnor. Due to their isolation, the men of Dunland avoided the worst of the plague, but the men of Cardolan who lived in Farbad and Menhiriath weren't as lucky. The lands of Cardolan seem to have suffered the most of all the afflicted lands, as those that lived in Menhiriath were almost entirely wiped out, except for a few secretive hunter folk who lived in the remaining woods. In the Barrow Downs, the last Dunedain of Cardolan were also entirely wiped out, effectively ending the kingdom of Cardolan. Shortly afterwards, the Witch King of Angmar would send evil spirits to inhabit the Barrow Downs, and they would remain there until the end of the Third Age. By 1637, the Great Plague had reached the Shire. At that point, hobbits had only lived in the Shire for a mere 37 years, and by the end of that year, most of those original settlers would be dead to the plague. Despite that, the Shire survived, and if it didn't, we'd all be speaking in black speech right now. However, the Shire ended up being the plague's last stop, as for one reason or another, it never really reached Fornost, and the waning kingdom of Arthedain was spared most of the hurts of the Great Plague. By the end of 1637, the Great Plague appeared to have fizzled out, and those people that survived began their slow recovery. Making an accurate guess of the death toll of the Great Plague would be nigh impossible, but if we're including all of the lands that were devastated, then the number would surely be in the millions. Gondor, near to the height of its power, was brought to its knees. In Rhovanion, over half the population died, and in places like Cardolan, almost the entirety of the population dies. This implies that the mortality rate was exceptionally high, and that huge percentages of either urban or concentrated populations would have been wiped out. So, what was the aftermath of such a devastating event? Well, the effects of the Great Plague could be felt all the way until the end of the Third Age, nearly 1500 years later. The kingdom of Rhovanion would never recover, being conquered by Easterlings 200 years later. Gondor would retreat inwards, abandoning much of its outer territories, including the Watch on Mordor, which would eventually have dire consequences in the future. Cardolan was completely wiped out by the plague, resulting in the decay and depopulation of most of Eredor's southern regions, and by the end of the Third Age, these regions would still be depopulated and in ruins. All things considered, most of these lands would never recover to pre-plague levels until the 4th Age. Now, I also want to answer some minor questions that would probably be asked in the comment sections before I move on to the big question. Firstly, did it affect elves and dwarves? In the case of elves, no, as elves are immune to sickness. As for dwarves, we don't actually know if they're immune to sickness. As far as I know, we don't hear of dwarves ever dying to sickness, but I don't think it's ever explicitly stated that they are immune to sickness. Either way, considering the doors of Khazad-dûm could easily be shut in a crisis like this, I doubt the dwarves were affected either. Secondly, how did it spread? We're not sure, but it can be assumed that human-to-human transmission was definitely a main way. Does that sound familiar at all? After all, urban areas or tightly packed populations were the most affected, and that isolated places like Dunland were very little affected. Considering Arthedain mostly escaped the effects of the Great Plague, it seems they closed their borders, never allowing the plague to actually gain a foothold there, almost like a Middle-earth version of a lockdown or a quarantine. And finally, the big question. Was Sauron responsible? Well, historians in Middle-earth suspected that he was, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. It's a mystery that will remain a mystery, but I'm still willing to pose the question, and I want you, the viewers, to decide for yourselves. So, what's the case for Sauron being responsible? Well, firstly, Sauron absolutely has a motive. His Easterling and Haradrim subjects have thus far failed to weaken Gondor, so he would need to take more desperate measures if he seeks to weaken the powerful kingdom. And biological warfare would probably be considered a desperate measure. The fact that the plague struck Gondor when its might was unmatched is very convenient timing. Secondly, Sauron would very likely have the capability. In the First Age, Morgoth unleashed a sickness on the men of Dol Guldur, and as we know, Sauron was Morgoth's lieutenant, and was very likely in Angband when Morgoth created the sickness. There's plenty of evidence that suggests that Sauron has the knowledge to create a plague. But would he have the power? Well, maybe, maybe not. He was in a weakened state during this time, but how much power does it take to create a plague? We don't know. Thirdly, evil started to reappear in Middle-earth at a far more rapid rate following the Great Plague, especially in Mirkwood. It's possible that Sauron and his minions were simply being opportunistic, but it's also possible that they were very aware that this would happen. And finally, as far as we know, there has only ever been one other plague in Middle-earth's history, an artificial plague created by Morgoth. If sickness and plague is a natural occurrence, surely it would happen more regularly like it does in our own world. Alright, we have the case for Sauron being responsible, but what's the case for Sauron not being responsible? What's the case for this plague simply being a natural occurrence? We're now role-playing as the lawyer who is defending the psychopathic mass murderer in court. So, firstly, the plague does just as much damage to Gondor's enemies. If Sauron created the plague, why not directly unleash it on Gondor? Why let it rip through Rhûn first? That's not to say that Sauron would overly care about collateral damage, but it seems like an odd decision. Perhaps the plague grew out of control, or perhaps he needed to test it on his own subjects first. Secondly, considering how effective the plague was, why would Sauron not create another? The death and devastation caused by the Great Plague was unmatched. It's possible that Sauron did not have the strength to create another. Perhaps he created it by accident, or perhaps he wanted to have subjects left to rule over, instead of them all being, dead. Or as stated, perhaps he had nothing to do with it at all. So, what do you think? Do you think Sauron caused it, or do you think it was just a natural occurrence that happened to work perfectly in Sauron's favour? Leave your comments below. I had a few requests to do this video on the Great Plague, and it just so happens that currently life is imitating art, albeit in a much less extreme way, which is for the best. So now seemed like an obvious time to do a video on the Great Plague. But speaking of sickness, I hope everyone who watches this is doing well, both physically and mentally. And remember, if there's an out-of-control virus spreading across the world, maybe stay indoors. It's probably the first and last time my end of video advice will be useful, so take it to heart. Thank you, goodbye.